Hello everybody, I'm going to start in just a minute. Going to let a few folks join with us. So I'll start about 1 minute or so here. Welcome aboard, folks. Good to see you. We'll start here in just a few seconds. Let a few others join in. All right, good afternoon and welcome to another Waukegan History Museum History Lunch and Learn. My name is Ty Rohr. I'm coming to you from my home in Waukegan, Illinois. I am the manager of cultural arts for the Waukegan Park District, and I also get to work on behalf of the Waukegan Historical Society. Hope everyone out there is doing well. Now, Waukegan has a rich history, and I have found over the years that Waukegan fits into many national or international stories. It has always been a fun challenge to connect Waukegan to other bigger or non-local stories. And back in 2011, as many were gearing up for the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, well, I decided to take a look through the passenger logs of the Titanic to see if I could find any Waukegan connections. I had already been aware of another Lake County connection at the time, but wondered if Waukegan could fit in somehow. Well, this is the story of what I found. Today's History Lunch and Learn, Titanic, a Fateful Ticket to Waukegan. The spring of 1912 in Waukegan was one of debate on the issues of women's suffrage and also on local prohibition. On April 2nd, 1912, the citizens voted to keep Waukegan a wet city and not ban liquor. Others at that time were finishing up their indoor baseball leagues, gearing up for the outdoor summer season. And the population of the city in Waukegan had tapered off some compared to the previous 2 decades. From 1890 to 1900, the population had risen by 5,000 people. From 1900 to 1910, Waukegan had continued to grow, gaining 7,000 more people, with the census data showing a population of over 16,000. Nearly, if not all of these people, or at least their parents or grandparents, had come to America at some point by boat. The stories and backgrounds of these immigrants are all different, yet they do share the similar experiences of getting to America. They chose to leave their homes for the prospects of a better life in a foreign country separated by a vast ocean. They could not guarantee that they would live successful lives in America, but more frightening was the thought that their voyage would be unsuccessful and that they would never be heard from again. Alfred Gustafson would have had these concerns when he first set out for America. He was young when he first left his home of Finland. Alfred was born on May 2nd, 1892, in Finland on the island of Åland. He had one older brother, Werner, who was born 2 years earlier. Werner left for America in 1910, and it is likely that his younger brother Alfred came with him at that point. We know that Werner arrived in New York in 1910 and started living in Brooklyn and working as a carpenter. Unfortunately, the story of Alfred is still very murky for us at this point. It appears that Alfred left his brother in New York and made his way to Waukegan. Alfred's Waukegan life has been elusive thus far for us, as we do not have city directories for 1910 and 1911, so we haven't been able to find exactly what he was doing. The surname of Gustafson does appear in the 1913 city directory 13 times. Could one of these Gustafsons be a relative of Alfred? It is possible, but that link has yet to be made. Why Alfred came to Waukegan we may never know, but it was most likely for work at one of the factories. A newspaper account does have Alfred living on George Avenue. And this makes sense, as this area around McAllister Avenue was where the majority of the Finnish population was living in Waukegan at the time. The first group of Finns to come to Waukegan moved from Worcester, Massachusetts through a transfer from the Washburn and Moen factory in that city. And Waukegan had its own wire mill of Washburn and Moen. And it is likely that Alfred knew someone in Waukegan and had been told to come to the city for work at that factory. Alfred decides to take a vacation from life and work in Waukegan, and he returns home to Finland. His friends in Waukegan expect to see him again in May of 1912. For James Ellsbury of Gurnee, his anxiety to come to America was many years in his past. James was born in Somerset, England in 1863. He immigrated to Lake County in 1884 and settled in Gurnee, where he purchased 105 acres to farm. Ellsbury, a successful farmer and prominent figure in Gurnee, was a father of 4 and was married to Eliza Jane Hucker. Ellsbury's father had recently passed away. He was called upon to return to England to assist his younger brother in the settling of his father's financial affairs. Ellsbury returned to England on November 20th, 1911. James's wife and children expected to see him again in March of 1912. The entire world was abuzz with the news of the British passenger liner of the White Star Line's newest ship, the Titanic. The reports of this ship fascinated the world. It was the largest ship ever built, was state-of-the-art, was designed to meet the highest standards of luxury, and was touted as being unsinkable. Titanic was built in Belfast, Ireland. She was 883 feet 9 inches long, with a maximum breadth of 92 feet 6 inches. Her total height, measured from the base of the keel to the top of the bridge, was 104 feet, and she weighed over 52,000 tons. The White Star Line intended for the Titanic, as well as her sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic, to change ocean travels. Much of the change as advertised with the Titanic dealt with the luxurious accommodations for not only first and second class passengers, but also for the third class. The third class accommodations on Titanic were equivalent to second class quarters on other ships at the time. And this added to the fascination for many. Not only could this ship take them to America, but they could also travel in high style. James Ellsbury had closed all of the financial affairs of his late father, but he made the decision not to return immediately to America. He held off his March return and changed his plans to come to America on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. He purchased a third-class ticket, number 3902. This ticket cost £7, or about $12 at the time. Ellsbury communicated with friends and family in America that he was set to return on April 10th. Strangely, he left out the important detail that he would be traveling aboard the Titanic. Alfred Gustafson decided to cut his vacation off early and return to Waukegan. Did traveling on the maiden voyage of Titanic and being a part of history sway his change in travel plans? We will never know this answer. Regardless, Gustafson communicated with friends in Waukegan that he was coming home in April. Apparently, he also did not say that he had purchased a third-class ticket aboard the Titanic. Both Gustafson and Ellsbury boarded the Titanic on Wednesday, April 10th in Southampton, England. Third class was the first to board the ship. Third-class passengers were inspected for ailments and physical impairments that might lead them to being refused entry to the United States. This was not a prospect that the White Star Line wished to see, as they would have to carry them back all the way across the Atlantic. When they boarded Titanic, she had only recently completed her sea trials, which had started 8 days earlier. Also, as was the tradition with the White Star Line, Titanic was not christened. Gustafson and Ellsbury would not have experienced the luxury of those in first class. However, their accommodations were better than nearly all other third-class quarters on other ships. There were cabins of different sizes that could sleep 2 to 10. On G-deck, there were 164 open cots provided for single young men, and it is possible that Gustafson and Ellsbury slept there. Their washing and bathing facilities were much more limited than what the first and second class experienced. There were only 2 bathrooms, one each for men and women for the entire third class. Gustafson and Ellsbury, being third-class passengers, would have had restrictions on what parts of the ship they could be in, as all 3 classes were segregated from each other. Titanic carried 2,223 people on the maiden voyage. The passengers numbered around 1,317, with 324 people in first class, 284 in second class, and 709 in the third class, sharing the 2 bathrooms. 869, or 66% were male, and 447, or 34%, were female. There were also 107 children aboard, the largest number of which were in third class. Titanic had 885 crew members on her maiden voyage, 2,223 people on board. On April 14th, at 11:40 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spotted an iceberg immediately ahead of Titanic and alerted the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch ordered the ship to be steered around the obstacle and the engines to be put in reverse. These efforts were too late, as the starboard side of Titanic struck the iceberg, creating a series of holes below the waterline. 5 of the ship's watertight compartments were breached, and it became apparent that the supposed unsinkable Titanic had been dealt a fatal blow. Where Gustafson and Ellsbury were at the moment of impact, we will never know. The following hours were marred with confusion from crew and passengers. For the most part, first and second class passengers were urged to the lifeboats on the top deck. Instructions were given to third class passengers to wait their turn in their part of the ship. Chaos on the lower decks occurred, with third class passengers finding themselves trapped behind locked gates, with many unable to communicate with the crew because they did not speak English. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, Titanic fell beneath the waters of the Atlantic. The April 15th paper in Waukegan, the Waukegan Daily Sun and the Waukegan Daily Gazette, have a brief article warning that the Titanic was in danger. It reads, "Ocean liner in danger. Titanic with more than 900 aboard strikes an iceberg. Montreal, April 15th. The new White Star Line Titanic is reported to have struck an iceberg. The news was received at the Allen lines here in a wireless message from the captain of the steamer Virginian of that line. It was stated that the Virginian had been in wireless communication with the Titanic and she asked for assistance. The Virginian reported that she was on her way to Titanic. The Virginian has 300 passengers on board, but can accommodate 900 more of the Titanic's passengers should their removal be necessary. This 102-word article would have brought forth nightmares and panic to many who read it. Waukegan, a city with many of its inhabitants sharing the same experiences of ocean travels, watched closely in the days to come of Titanic's fate. This first article in the April 15th papers, though, would give many a sense of false hope, as it sounds as if all aboard the Titanic will be able to be transported to the Virginian, if needed. Also, the report of Titanic carrying 900 passengers was only off by 1,300 people. Any hope that Titanic was fine was shattered when reading the April 16th papers. People now realized that the worst tragedy at sea had occurred, and the first reports were coming in that 1,500 had died. It is reported that the Carpathia had taken on some of the Titanic's passengers, and others may have been picked up by other nearby ships. This gives hope that the reported 1,500 dead is inaccurate. The reaction to the news of the sinking of the Titanic is great sadness, not just for the many who died, but also for the great ship. It was reported in the April 16th Daily Sun that a few of the old-timers, as it states, knew Titanic's captain, Edward John Smith. He was said to have sailed on the waters of Lake Michigan, working a route from Chicago to locations to the north, making stops in Waukegan. Many were sad to hear his fate. However, regarding the story, we were not able to find any records indicating that Smith had spent time on Lake Michigan. On April 17th, the report comes in that the only survivors are aboard the Carpathia, and the number of dead has increased to over 2,000. It is reported that the list of survivors has been wirelessly transmitted from the Carpathia, and it contains mostly women and children. Only those who are the most well-known are listed at first. As the reports of survivors start to trickle in, the list of those aboard the ship has yet to be made known. The April 18 Waukegan Daily Sun has an article titled, "Fear Relatives Were Drowned on Ill-Fated Titanic." By this point, the first and second class passengers who survived have been announced. The worried people in Waukegan do not see their loved ones on this list, and they did not expect to, as they believed they would have purchased third-class tickets. Worried family members and friends continued calling the newspapers for any updates on their loved ones. In 2 instances, husbands had sent money to their wives and families to come join them in Waukegan, and they feared that they were aboard the Titanic. What an anxious and trying time for many in Waukegan, and the rest of the world for that matter. It is hard to imagine today a time when information is not given to us at an instant. In 1912, the technologies of communicating were vastly different than today. April 18th. The headline for the Daily Gazette is "James Ellsbury, Lake County man, went down on the Titanic." His name was found in the passenger list of those who were on the ship that was starting to trickle in over wireless communications. Here you see the passenger list with James Ellsbury, farmer, 47, with the ticket number 3902. Now, James Ellsbury's wife, when contacted by the paper and told the news, stated that she still was not sure if it was her husband that was listed as a passenger, as she was still holding out hope that he had taken another ship. All that she knew was that he was planning to leave around the same time the Titanic left, and that he was also going to bring a niece along. Mrs. Ellsbury believed that all of the women were saved from Titanic, so when the name of the niece was not found, she believed that meant that her husband had taken another ship. At one point, Ellsbury's wife received word that a man had been picked up in an unconscious condition by the rescue ship Carpathia and had been placed in a New York hospital. The man's only words were Lake County, Illinois. While the Ellsbury family was still hanging on to a last string of hope, others were still waiting for news of whether their loved ones were lost on the ship. The friends of Alfred Gustafson see his name under the headline, "Second Local Man Reported on Titanic," on the first page of the April 19th Daily Gazette. Alfred was reported to the paper by the ticket agent who had sold him his ticket to take his vacation back to his homeland of Finland. The ticket agent believed that Gustafson was to return May 1st, but was sure that it was the same Gustafson who had been previously living in Waukegan. Many on the south side of Waukegan had spent the last couple of days in fear that they knew someone who had died on the Titanic. Gustafson was the only resident aboard the ship. The story of Gustafson trails off after the initial articles about his name appearing in the passenger logs. He had listed Waukegan as his ultimate destination when he purchased his fateful ticket. However, he never made it back home, and Alfred Gustafson's body was never recovered. Mrs. Ellsbury, still with hope that her husband was alive, received a letter from James's younger brother John. He stated in the letter that his brother had indeed been on the Titanic. The Ellsbury family now had to wait for hope that James's body was recovered, but unfortunately, it never was either. By this time, the world was consumed with the story of what happened to the Titanic and the struggles of the lucky few to make it in a lifeboat. Most importantly, though, the world wanted to know who was to blame. The United States Senate jumped in to do a formal inquiry into the disaster. This was watched locally as well as around the world with great intrigue. The nation also wanted to know what they could do to help the widows who survived the disaster. A fund was established to raise money for the local survivors. Locally, the Daily Sun started a fund where residents could send money to go to the National Fund. Additionally, the Daily Sun and the Barrison Theater coordinated to have a benefit concert to help raise money for this fund. So here you see Titanic Sufferers Benefit at the Barrison. The Titanic Sufferers Benefit, as it was called, was held on Wednesday, April 24th. The Waukegan Male Quartet graciously offered to provide their services for both the matinee and evening shows. The Barrison Theater kept only 5% of the profits, and the benefit raised $7 for the cause. This would be around $800 today. On a side note, a young Benjamin Kubelski was working at the Barrison Theater at the time, playing his violin in the pit orchestra. Did Benjamin, later known as Jack Benny, participate in the Titanic Survivors Benefit? Well, as more and more of the stories start to come in from the survivors of the disaster, an interesting story pops up in the April 21st Daily Gazette with the headline, "Titanic Fate Will Affect Local Boats." The concern from many in Waukegan was that the many boats on Lake Michigan were also ill-equipped for a disaster. By April 21st, numerous stories concerned the Titanic's lack of enough lifeboats for all aboard. The law at that time on Lake Michigan amazingly allowed for excursion boats, like you see in the picture here, to carry 2,500 people. This maximum capacity was more than the number of passengers aboard the Titanic on her maiden voyage. The number of lifeboats needed by law on the Lake Michigan excursion boats was a staggering low number. The number of lifeboats was determined not by the number of passengers, but by the tonnage of the vessel. The example in the article gives a large excursion boat only having enough lifeboats for 126 people, while it could hold a maximum capacity of that 2,500. Plans are now underway to improve the safety standards of the Lake Michigan boats. The rest of the Titanic stories in April 1912 revolve around the Senate hearings. In May, James Ellsbury's name does pop up again, though. It is reported that the White Star Line is not liable to Ellsbury's widow for loss of life and cargo. This starts a year-long battle between the Ellsbury family and the White Star Line. In the end, the White Star Line did not have to pay Mrs. Ellsbury for damages, and a good majority of third-class passengers' families were not paid for their loss. The Titanic story does not die down in May of 1912. On May 4th, the Barrison Theater advertises the Titanic disaster in motion pictures. Now, they do not claim to have footage of the sinking, but rather moving pictures of scenes from before and after that ill-fated night. The May 6th Daily Sun starts a 5-day-long segment of the story titled The Wreck of Titan by Morgan Robertson. Now, this story was written 14 years before the sinking of the Titanic. It tells of a large ocean liner named Titan that strikes an iceberg. What an eerily similar story to that of the Titanic. The nation continued to watch for the latest news on the disaster, but over time, new stories of importance took precedence. Although Titanic sank over 100 years ago, it has never lost the hearts and imagination of the world. It impacted and brought fear to even those in Waukegan and Lake County when she sank. Many worried that their loved ones had purchased Fateful tickets on the ship. The majority of people in Waukegan and Lake County would come to find that their loved ones were not aboard the Titanic. This would not be the case for the friends and families of Alfred Gustafson and James Ellsbury, as they were two of the 1,514 who died in the frigid waters of the Atlantic. The story of the Titanic has been told and retold an uncountable number of times. I hope that you enjoyed this version with its connections to Waukegan and Lake County. Well, that's the story, and I hope you enjoyed it. I appreciate you joining me, and I hope soon that we can gather again to do these in person, and I hope to have the museum up and running as well for people to be able to visit. Speaking of the museum, I wonder what has been happening there lately. All quiet, I'm sure. Next week, I'll be back at this again with the topic, The Civil War, Waukegan's War Efforts. So see you then on April 17th at 12 p.m. On behalf of the Waukegan History Museum of the Waukegan Park District and the Waukegan Historical Society, have a great weekend. This is Ty Rohr, signing off.